A rising music star had a sexual relationship with 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez. On top of the accusations that David killed Celeste, dismembered her body, and disposed of it. It's important to remember that he is also charged with sexual abuse of a child under 14. Police laid out alleged child sexual abuse material found on the singer's phone that could be damning if this case goes to trial. I will also tell you about the gruesome new details revealed today about how the teen may have died, which caused a gasp.
First, a preliminary hearing in Los Angeles just flipped what prosecutors thought they'd proven and what the public thought they knew about a rising music star's relationship with a 14-year-old. Second, inside text messages filed as evidence, a coded operation emerges with a name that sounds innocuous but documents systematic manipulation. Third, the medical examiner's testimony introduces a new possibility, one the defense immediately exploits, about how a young woman actually died. And fourth, in real time, in court, the defendant loses his composure for the first time when his own phone's contents are described aloud. This is what happened on day 4 of David Burke's preliminary hearing. But here's what matters: the narrative everyone believed going in wasn't what the evidence showed coming out. And that's a distinction worth sitting with. For weeks, covering this case meant accepting one particular story about the relationship between music producer David Burke and 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez. The story was simple, and it was wrong. Or at least, it was incomplete. Celeste, we'd been told, was the one pushing. She was jealous. She was trying to keep David to herself. She was the one initiating contact, demanding more time, more commitment. That's the frame that circulated. That's what made sense of why he might want her gone. Or so the theory went. But on Friday, during testimony from LAPD Detective Corey Farrell, text messages recovered from David's iCloud account told a different version entirely, and prosecutors made sure the court understood the difference. They read aloud exchanges spanning months.
Charging documents, we've reported on this. Prosecutors have described photos they found in David's iCloud account on his devices. They've described text messages between the two of them referencing sexual activity and things like abortion, emergency contraception. Today in court, during day 4 of this preliminary hearing, we actually got to see and read some of those text messages. Now, we did not see any explicit photos because that, of course, is child sexual abuse material. We did hear from another LAPD detective who took the stand, Corey Farrell, and
they showed images, not explicit images of abuse, which are restricted, but photographs taken by the defendant and the victim together. Diamond engagement ring on her 13-year-old hand, the two of them kissing in bed, selfies in his Tesla, and through all of it, the texts revealed that David was the one bringing up the future. David was the one mentioning moving in together. David was the one discussing a wedding, having children together, building a life with a child. This matters because it reframes everything that came before.
Los Angeles, today perhaps the most graphic, explicit, visual, and potentially damning evidence in this case against the rising music star. Joining us now once again, Julia Dang from NBC LA, a reporter who is in the courtroom for day 4 of this preliminary hearing. Julia, this afternoon, a lot of focus on text messages between David and Celeste. Walk us through what I know was a very emotional final part of the day here.
Chris, a lot of damning evidence today as it relates to not the murder charge, but another felony charge in this case against David Anthony Burke. It's the felony count of continuous sexual abuse of a child under 14. Of course, they're
The media, following initial police characterizations, had emphasized Celeste's supposed jealousy, her alleged obsession with keeping David's attention. But the digital record showed something else.
Today, previously we heard the relationship characterized as maybe one-sided, right? It sounded like Celeste, this teenager, was pushing for more, and she was jealous of David's relationships with other women. So the text messages that were read aloud and shown to us in court today actually flip that narrative. That surprised me. I was not expecting that during testimony today.
In March 2025, just weeks before her death in May, Celeste was the one stepping back. She was the one saying she wanted to move on. She said she was okay with staying friends, but she didn't want to be connected online anymore. She said she wasn't interested in continuing to have sex with him. That's not the language of someone desperate to hold onto a relationship. That's the language of someone trying to extract herself from one. And it's a distinction, a real one. That changes how you read everything else. The story wasn't about an obsessed teenager and a reluctant adult. The story was about an adult in his 20s pursuing a child, initiating intimacy, planning a future that should never have been possible. Detective Farrell, on the stand, made sure that frame was clear. But before we get to the text messages, there's another detail that emerged in court, something reporters covering the case hadn't connected to this moment until Friday afternoon. And it's called Operation Awesome. That name, that phrase, appears in text exchanges dated to February 2024, roughly a month after prosecutors say Celeste became pregnant and had an abortion at 13 years old. In the messages, David and Celeste discuss a plan. It's coded, but not subtle. Operation Awesome, as it turns out, is the name they gave to Celeste's planned runaway from her home in Lake Elsinore.
Period, where we saw text message conversations today in court showing that David and Celeste were talking about something called OA, Operation Awesome, where they were plotting her departure, her runaway from her home in Lake Elsinore. And this struck me too. David appears to be the one pushing this. He's the one who keeps on asking her, do you have your bags packed? He tells her, bring everything you're going to use that I can't immediately replace. Bring a bigger bag. Do you have everything packed? Are you ready to go? In one of these messages from that particular exchange, he calls that her runaway date, and I believe it was the day before Valentine's Day in 2024. He calls it the most important day of her life, aside from their anticipated wedding. Again, at this time,
it's a scheme, and according to the testimony, David is the one pushing it forward. He asks repeatedly, do you have your bags packed? He tells her to bring everything she might need. He uses language like, bring a bigger bag. Are you ready to go? In one exchange, he refers to it as her runaway date. He says it's the most important day of her life, aside from their anticipated wedding. And this is happening while she is 13 years old. This is happening a few weeks after a pregnancy, after an abortion. This is happening while she lives with her family, who, as far as the records show, had no idea about any of this. The operation wasn't some spontaneous plan. It was coordinated. It was discussed. It was dated. And the texts show that David was directing it, orchestrating it, keeping it moving forward. That detail didn't get wide circulation until day 4 of the preliminary hearing, when Detective Farrell read those messages aloud in court. Now, there's something worth noting here. Something that speaks to how myths spread faster than corrections in true crime coverage. Many outlets, in the early stages of reporting this case, characterized the relationship as one-sided because Celeste appeared jealous of David's other romantic interests. That detail came from police. That detail came from early characterizations. And it stuck. But the digital evidence complicates it, inverts it, demands a reframe. The jealousy angle positioned her as the aggressor, the pursuer, the one unable to accept the relationship's limits. The texts, by contrast, position David as the one initiating intimacy, planning a future, orchestrating an escape. Celeste, in those same texts, is cautious, hesitant, eventually retreating. This matters because it shapes how you understand motive. If Celeste was the jealous party, then sure, maybe she threatened to expose David, and maybe that gives him reason to harm her. But if David was the pursuer, the manipulator, the one planning their future together despite her reservations, then the calculus shifts. Then you're looking at a pattern of behavior that extends far beyond the moment of her death. Then you're looking at years of calculated engagement with a child. That's the reading the prosecution was building on Friday. And it's a reading the digital evidence actually supports.
Everything that I heard and saw today in court relating to this digital evidence flipped what I thought I knew about the nature of their relationship. It does not seem to me like Celeste was the one pushing for more. She's actually the one who seems a little bit more casual a little bit more hesitant in these messages. To me, David is the one who is aggressively pursuing more time together, living together, going on trips together. He's the one who's initiating a lot of this, and you just can't get past her age during all of this. She is 13. She is just barely 14.
The responses from both victim's family and the defendant himself told their own story on Friday afternoon. Mercedes Rivas Hernandez, Celeste's mother, sat through descriptions of photos showing her daughter at 13 with an engagement ring on her
Today
finger.
might have actually been the toughest day for me. I can tell you it was a tough day for the victim's parents. Her mother, Mercedes, who sat through autopsy testimony, who sat through images showing her daughter's remains in the cadaver bags. She walked out of the courtroom during this testimony today. I could hear her holding back, racking sobs. The victim's father walked out behind her. So did their attorney, their wrongful death attorney, Patrick Steinfeld. And I think it's because this is actually the first time during the course of this preliminary hearing where Celeste is being presented as a living human, a young girl who is very much alive, a young girl who has a voice, who is...
She sat through testimony about sexual abuse material found on the defendant's phone. She sat through the details of the abortion appointment in January 2024.
And the Plan B morning after pill in their text message exchanges. But today we actually saw messages discussing an abortion appointment for Celeste in January of 2024. Now, do the math there. Her birthday was September of 2010. She was 13 when this purported abortion took place.
And then she left the courtroom, unable to continue watching, unable to sit still while her daughter was reduced to evidence, to a collection of images and text strings. Her husband followed. Their attorney followed.
Who sat through autopsy testimony, who sat through images showing her daughter's remains in the cadaver bags. She walked out of the courtroom during this testimony today. I could hear her holding back, racking sobs. The victim's father walked out behind her. So did their attorney, their wrongful death attorney, Patrick Steinfeld. And I think it's because
This was the first time in the preliminary hearing, according to courtroom observers, that Celeste was being presented not as a victim of a crime, but as a living human being with agency, with wants, with words of her own. Before this, she was autopsy testimony. She was a bag of decomposing remains. She was a medical examiner's detailed description of internal injuries. But when her own voice, her own text messages, her own images were read into the record, the humanity became unavoidable. And for the people who loved her, that was too much to bear in a courtroom while the man accused of killing her sat taking notes. Speaking of which, David Burke's composure in that courtroom broke for the first time on Friday.
This was interesting, too. This was actually the first instance, Chris, during this preliminary hearing where it seemed to me like David was actively engaged in his own defense. Today was the first time I actually noticed him using the pen or pencil in front of him and that yellow legal notepad that I keep on peeking at, trying to see if he's taking any notes. Before today, I haven't seen him writing anything down, and I've got an eye on him at all times just to see how he's reacting to what's being said about him, his actions. Nothing before today, not a single thing written down. But today, as they were talking about the photos found on his phone and the text messages recovered from his iCloud account, I did notice him hunching over and starting to jot something down. I did notice him having whispered conversations with his attorneys. At one point, this was when, and this was really tough. This was actually what prompted the victim's mother to start crying and both of her parents to walk out of the courtroom, flanked by their attorney. But when they were describing the incredibly explicit images of David and Celeste engaged in various types of sexual activity found on David's phone. I noticed David losing his composure.
For every previous day of the preliminary hearing, observers noted that he was still composed, staring straight ahead, not giving much away. He didn't react to the autopsy photos. He didn't react to descriptions of his alleged crimes. But when Detective Farrell began describing the explicit images of Burke and Celeste found on his phone, that changed. Burke started fidgeting. He hunched over his legal notepad. He began writing things down, something no one had seen him do before. His right leg jiggled beneath the table. He whispered to his attorneys.
You could see him starting to fidget. It was like he was shrinking in his seat. He looked out at one point. I could see his right leg jiggling up and down. And I'm really curious what he wrote down. Really curious what he shared with his attorneys during that exchange. Because it wasn't just one photo or two that LAPD Detective Corey Farrell described on the stand. It was a series of photos, probably dozens. It got to a point where there were so many descriptions. They were so explicit. You can see in my notes, Chris.
And for courtroom watchers, including the experienced reporter in the room, this shift was striking. It wasn't the graphic autopsy images that cracked his facade. It was his own phone. It was evidence of his own involvement. It was the documentary record of a relationship he'd apparently helped orchestrate and document. That's worth sitting with. The death of his alleged victim didn't move him visibly. His own culpability did.
Difficult to look at, but you have to wonder, based on how members of the media are reacting during a preliminary hearing, how might a jury react if they see what prosecutors have presented? David, however, has been, we're told, pretty stoic through it all.
Here's a question that doesn't have a clean answer yet, and it's one worth considering as the case continues. What does the text message evidence actually prove about the murder? This is where the preliminary hearing hits a different kind of complexity. The sexual abuse charge under California law is straightforward. The digital evidence supports it directly. Timestamped text messages, cloud-stored photos, documented exchanges. These things are hard to defend. The defense attorneys, according to courtroom observers, lodged very few objections during this portion of testimony.
I was surprised by this, too. There were not very many objections lodged by Blair Burke and Marilyn Bednarski during this portion of testimony today, as we were hearing about and seeing this digital evidence. And prior to today, they've had a sharp line of questioning. They've had objections. They've had active defense, active strategy in response to just about everything. The fact that they could find gaps in DNA evidence yesterday, right? I wasn't expecting them to just let this LAPD detective go on and continue describing those photos, but that's exactly what they did. And that tells me this is hard.
They didn't challenge the authenticity or the collection methods, and that silence is informative. It suggests they know the sexual abuse charge is probably going to stick, but the murder charge is different. The murder charge requires proving that David Burke killed Celeste Rivas Hernandez. And here's where things get contested. The text messages don't show a murder plan.
With these very graphic photos and these very explicit text messages. I can tell you this, though. They don't say anything just yet about the actual killing of Celeste. They only speak to the nature of the relationship between the victim and the defendant before she died.
They show a relationship. They show manipulation. They show the initiation of a runaway. But they don't show the moment of death or the circumstances of it. That's where the medical examiner's testimony becomes critical. And that's where the defense has some room to work.
That apparently the LAPD has. The other key witness today, Grant Ho, deputy medical examiner, he and his team do the autopsy on Celeste Rivas Hernandez. There's been a big question about cause of death in this case. We know something horrific happened to this young woman, her body dismembered, according to police. What was the piece of information you saw come out of this? Piece of information that came out of this just related to how we know Celeste died at this point?
So there was a lot of buzz around this autopsy that was conducted last fall after the body was found, and it took about 3 months for them to actually release their final findings. And we learned today that's because they had to do some ancillary testing. Essentially, this deputy medical examiner, he was one of 2 people involved in doing the autopsy. They wanted to wait for toxicology testing to come back to confirm that she didn't die from an overdose. They wanted to know that before releasing this report and finalizing their finding that it was
Dr. Grant Ho, the LA County Deputy Medical Examiner, spent significant time on Friday describing penetrating injuries to Celeste's body. Multiple penetrating injuries, wounds to her liver, disruption to her ribs, a wound on her left flank, her diaphragm damaged.
Injuries he found, describing how the penetrating wounds to the overlying skin are associated with internal damage found inside. That includes damage to the victim's liver. He described how he used his own fingers to palpate her ribs, how he found damage or disruptions to that underlying bone, how that sits right beneath a second penetrating wound that he found on her left flank. So he painted a very clear picture of what happened to this 14-year-old. Now, here's what the defense did with that. It was Marilyn Bednarski leading cross-examination of Dr. Grant Ho this morning. She made it very clear. You may have these findings. You may have this autopsy report. You may have these shocking visuals, but you don't actually know for sure what kind of sharp instrument was used. You don't actually know for sure which penetrating wound.
The medical picture is brutal and detailed. But here's what Dr. Ho was also careful to say, and here's where defense attorney Marilyn Bednarski saw an opening. He doesn't know for certain what instrument caused the injuries. He doesn't know the sequence. He doesn't know if the wounds happened seconds apart or at different times. And in one exchange that drew visible reactions in the courtroom, Bednarski suggested that the victim herself might have been holding the knife. Dr. Ho had to concede. Based on the advanced state of decomposition, he couldn't rule it out. Now, prosecutors probably think that line of questioning is absurd. Observers in the courtroom certainly thought so. But it's a reminder that the digital evidence, as damning as it is, speaks to a relationship, not to a killing.
Occurred first. You don't know for sure if they happened seconds apart. And then defense actually insinuated today during cross-examination of this witness that they don't know for sure if the victim herself may have been holding the knife that stabbed her. There were a couple looks exchanged in the courtroom after Bednarski said that. And after the witness did in fact confirm that no, he does not know due to the advanced state of decomposition of the victim's remains. But everybody looked around, and I think that bordered on absurd to a couple of the people in the courtroom I spoke with during the lunch.
The murder charge still needs to be proven separately, and that proof so far comes from the medical examiner's evidence, which, while graphic, is also subject to interpretation, to gaps, to alternative theories. It's not ironclad. It's not yet uncontestable. This is the burden of proof in action, and it's playing out in real time. The preliminary hearing is not a trial about guilt or innocence. It's a threshold question: is there enough evidence to take this case to trial? And on that standard, Day 4 of testimony probably moved prosecutors closer to their goal. The sexual abuse evidence is overwhelming. The digital record is extensive. The timeline is documented. But the murder charge still requires a jury to believe, beyond a reasonable doubt, that David Burke killed Celeste Rivas Hernandez. And the mechanism of that killing, who held the knife, when it happened, what preceded it, remains contested ground. Defense attorneys, according to the reporter in the courtroom, are aggressively doing their job in finding those gaps, in challenging assumptions, in asking questions that make space for reasonable doubt. That's their role. That's the system working. But it's also a reminder that digital evidence, even when it's this extensive, this intimate, this graphic, doesn't always fill every evidentiary gap. Sometimes it complicates the narrative without resolving it. One overlooked detail in most coverage of this case is the timeline of the alleged pregnancy and abortion. Celeste was 13 years old in January 2024 when the abortion appointment took place. 13. That detail appears in the preliminary hearing testimony because prosecutors are building a pattern. They're showing that David's involvement in Celeste's life wasn't casual or recent. They're documenting that he was part of her most intimate medical decisions. They were discussing pregnancy, abortion, contraception, the future, and all of this while she was a child. When you layer that onto the Operation Awesome messages from February 2024, which describe David orchestrating her runaway just weeks later, you start to see a structure to his behavior. It's not random, it's not impulsive, it's coordinated, it's planned, it's documented. And yet, in much of the early coverage, this sequence, the pregnancy, the abortion, the runaway plan, didn't get emphasized as a pattern. It got mentioned as facts individually without the connective tissue made clear. That's partly because preliminary hearings release evidence piecemeal and full pictures emerge slowly. But it's also because the narrative arc, the pattern of escalation and control, is sometimes harder to see than individual dramatic moments. Detective Farrell's testimony on Friday made that pattern explicit. The questioning from prosecutors and the responses from Detective Farrell also included a detail about the medical examiner's report that hadn't been widely known. It took 3 months to finalize. The body was found in the fall. The report came out months later. And the reason, according to Dr. Ho's testimony, was that they were waiting for toxicology testing. They wanted to rule out an overdose before finalizing their conclusion that penetrating injuries killed Celeste. That's standard forensic procedure, but it's also a moment where alternative theories could have emerged. If toxicology had shown something different, if the autopsy results had pointed somewhere else, the whole narrative would have shifted. As it happened, toxicology confirmed that the injuries, not a drug or poison, were the cause of death. But that lag time, that period of uncertainty, is part of what makes this case complex. The conclusion the medical examiner reached is probably correct. The evidence probably supports it, but it's not instantaneous, it's not obvious. It required testing, consultation, careful qualification of language. Dr. Ho was extremely careful in his testimony to use words like potentially or possibly when describing uncertainty.
This generated quite a bit of buzz after it came out during his testimony. He says after palpating the victim's left ribs and noting an area of disruption or damage that he didn't see anywhere else underneath one of those penetrating wounds, the one on her upper chest, the one that caused damage to her diaphragm, he said, this could have been caused by perhaps a gunshot wound. So that raised a couple eyebrows. We haven't heard that previously. I think the general assumption or understanding is that this victim was stabbed and she bled out. That's what prosecutors have been alleging. That's what was in the initial charging documents. So Grant Ho actually revisited that point later, and he made sure to tell the court on record that he said that because he wanted to make the point that it could.
That carefulness is the opposite of the sensationalized version of autopsy testimony you sometimes see in popular media. Real forensic testimony is hedged, qualified, precise. And that precision is where defense attorneys find leverage. As the preliminary hearing continues, the question that remains open is this: how will defense attorneys handle the digital evidence when they have the chance to cross-examine Detective Farrell? They didn't lodge many objections on Friday, which suggests they're conceding the authenticity and the collection methods. But cross-examination could still challenge the interpretation. It could explore alternative readings of the text messages. It could ask whether Celeste's words were truly reflective of her situation or whether they were coerced, coached, or misrepresented. The explicit images on the phone are the hardest evidence to explain away. But even there, a defense attorney might ask questions about when they were taken, in what context, with what understanding from the alleged victim. These are the lines of questioning that will actually determine whether a jury sees the case the same way prosecutors do. The preliminary hearing is just the beginning. By Monday morning, when court resumes at 9:15 Pacific time, the prosecution will have completed its case, at least for now.
That's what he means.
And as far as here we are, it's on Friday. We weren't sure if this was going to continue on into next week, but court is going to begin 9:15 in the morning Pacific time on Monday. Any expectation about what's going to happen Monday and how long this could go for?
I thought they were going to call another witness. It sounds like LAPD Detective Corey Farrell might actually be the final witness for the prosecution.
Detective Farrell will presumably face cross-examination. The defense will have a chance to call witnesses or present evidence, or they may rest, betting that they can poke enough holes in the prosecution's case at trial. The judge will then decide whether probable cause exists to take this to trial. Given the digital evidence, given the medical evidence, given the timeline, that's probably a low bar for prosecutors
Without
to clear.
a doubt, yeah. I mean, this continuing on to Monday, I have no idea. I would never try to say that I know how this is going to go one way or another, but you do think to this point, it would be such a shock if the judge was to say that this didn't reach the bar where this could continue on, because this preliminary hearing, it's not about innocent or guilt. It's about, is there enough evidence to at least take this thing to trial? With the deputy medical examiner, and he was someone...
But it's not automatic. It's not certain. And that's the space where the real legal work happens. Not in the drama of preliminary hearing testimony, but in the careful construction of arguments about what evidence actually proves and what it leaves unproven. That's where juries get confused. That's where convictions get challenged on appeal. That's where the system either works or breaks down. Here's what's genuinely interesting to consider, and where I'd like to hear from you. The text messages revealed David's initiation of intimacy, his orchestration of the runaway, his planning of a future with a child. That pattern is documented. It's clear. But does that pattern necessarily explain why he killed her, if in fact he did kill her? Or does it show something different? That the relationship was manipulative, that it was wrong, that it was criminal, but that the motive for murder might be something else entirely. Some theories suggest he killed her because she was going to expose the relationship. Some suggest it was a crime of passion. Some suggest something we don't know yet. The text messages show motive possibility, but they don't show decision, the moment when he chose to end her life. That's a gap. That's a real gap in the evidence, and it's exactly the kind of gap that defense attorneys exploit. So what do you think? Does the pattern of manipulation and control necessarily imply a motive for murder, or are those separate questions that need separate evidence? Drop your thoughts in the comments. That's a real question the case hasn't fully answered yet. Monday morning, court resumes. The prosecution probably rests after cross-examination. The defense probably argues that the evidence, while damning on the sexual abuse charge, doesn't conclusively prove murder beyond reasonable doubt. The judge probably finds probable cause anyway, because the threshold is lower at a preliminary hearing. And then this case moves to trial, where a jury will have to answer the questions that preliminary hearings leave open. That's when the real work starts. That's when the contradictions matter. That's when the gaps in evidence become a space for reasonable doubt to grow. Until then, what we know is this: the digital evidence is extensive, the timeline is documented, the pattern is clear, and the case is far from finished. We'll continue tracking this as it develops. Subscribe for updates on this case and others like it, because the preliminary hearing is never the end of the story. It's just the moment when the story starts becoming public. And often, the public version is only the beginning of what the full record will eventually show.